If you ask us why we're here, we would say to glorify God. At the same time, we're here for our own personal reasons. We are here to glorify God because we know it will make us better as individuals. We are here because we want to live happier, more meaningful lives. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as that desire is coupled with an understanding of what our obligation to heaven is. And that's why we're here. I'm thankful that you are here and hope that in the next few moments we will all derive a blessing from the teachings of the Apostle Paul, inspired by the Spirit of God, as he wrote these wonderful words, very familiar words, but we always do well to notice the richness of each of the elements that he mentions should be the objects of our daily thoughts, of all our thoughts. We want to consider that and notice how he's telling us that there are three things we have to do in this broader context. Back in verse 5, he had said earlier that we are to let our moderation be known unto all men. Now, there are newer translations that translate that word, not moderation, but gentleness. And that's the idea. And it's a challenge. We're not going to say a lot about that. That's not the sermon today, but it is the background for what the sermon is. He says we are to control our actions. We're to be gentle to other people. And verse 6 says we are to control our attitudes. We are to be careful or anxious for nothing. And that's getting closer to the theme at hand. But of course, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let our requests be made known unto God. And he speaks of, well, this is what I was talking about a moment ago. He speaks of our goal in life, happiness, peace. The peace of God that passeth all understanding will keep our hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Now, there's not a one of us that couldn't honestly say that's not our goal. It is. To be free from turmoil, to be free from anxiety, free from sadness, free from our own passions in many cases, which are like shackles that prevent us from living the life we should live. He's telling us we can have that, and here's how. And of course, then he talks about the self-discipline or control of our very thoughts. And I want to consider that for just a little while this morning. Now, you are aware of the fact that Christianity does not have a monopoly on the idea of thought control. All the world's religions claim to. Hinduism, which was formed hundreds of years before the time of Christ, stresses that, but not according to truth. It stresses the idea that you are to become one with beingness itself, whatever that means. You are to learn who Brahman, or what Brahman is, whatever that really is or means. It's everything, it's all. It's indefinable. It's the word that cannot be spoken, but that's how you're to train or discipline your thoughts. Very abstract, you see. And it sounds very intelligent. But maybe in the end, they're not really saying a whole lot that's of any substance. Then you move on to, well, a spin-off of Hinduism, the Buddhists, whose chief emphasis in life is to train you not to want to have things. Because if you want to have things, you won't always get them. Most of the time we are thwarted in our purposes in life, and that makes us unhappy. So how be happy? Just don't want anything. It's very gloomy, very pessimistic. Be free from all desire, and therefore you will be free from all disappointment. Then you move on to Islam, which is really a Jewish Christian kind of heresy with a mixture of some Arab ideas, original native ideas. And it says, be submissive to the will of Allah. Well, what they mean by that is not what we would mean by talking about obeying the personal God of the Bible out of love and respect. What they mean by that is you submit to what has been decreed from all eternity. It's a very fatalistic view of God, a very strongly predestinated kind of view of God. And be submissive to the society or the state that is ruled under God. It's a theocratic rule. And all of those would stress mind control, but not in the way Christianity does, not in a very practical way. We know Paul tells us right here to think on certain things. These things, he will mention them in a moment. Think on these things. Now, this is a term in the Greek that we should be aware of. When it's translated in English to think, it can also be translated to deliberately think about something, to do it on purpose. That's the idea. We think about a lot of things that we don't mean to. They just are ideas that sort of pop into our heads. They well up in our being. stream of consciousness. Some people live that way. Just live for the moment. Whatever spontaneously comes into their mind, that they're interested in. But no, he's talking about deliberate thought, deliberately on purpose thinking about certain things, taking those things into account. So that tells me that he is aware that even as human beings who are prone to sin, we still have the ability to an extent to control our thoughts. I believe he would say, though, along with his companion James, the brother of the Lord, that it's difficult to control certain things. James says it's almost impossible to control the tongue in James chapter 3 and verse 8. And likewise, Paul would probably admit it's a difficult thing to do, to control the thoughts behind the words of our tongue, and yet it can be done, or else he wouldn't have counseled it. He tells us to learn to think upon certain things. Christianity is supreme because it teaches actual, workable mind control. The very best kind of mind control. The kind that you and I impose upon ourselves. That we allow to happen because of the God-given free will that we have. In Romans 12 and verse 2 he says, we are to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Now that word transformed is the same word that is used in the case of the transfiguration of Jesus on the Mount. Jesus was transformed into another appearance from what he typically had on the earth as just a human being in the flesh. Something very special, very unusual was seen in Jesus when he was transformed. And that's what we're to be in our thinking, transformed. So there's much in the Bible about that. But let's just look at what he says, because I believe we have here such treasures we've so frequently overlooked. When he says, finally, my brethren, and then he names a list of just a few important matters that we are to think upon deliberately. He says, think on these things. First of all, whatsoever things are true. Truth. This is the greatest question of all the ages. Truth. What is truth? Was Pilate's question to our Lord Jesus himself in John 18:38. Because Jesus had confidently affirmed he had come into this world to bear witness to what Jesus called the truth. Pilate comes from a totally different background, paganism and much skepticism with his upbringing, his education. So, as many of his educated peers would have said, just as they are saying today, he just wanted to know, how do you define that? What is truth? What is truth? We're living in a crisis period of truth today, more than ever before in Western civilization, in our own culture. We don't recognize our country very much anymore. So much of it has changed. The people around us have changed because the very concept, the very basic idea of truth itself is being warped and twisted. Now this phenomenon of changing the very concept of truth itself has been going on for millennia. But it really came to the fore just a few decades back with a movement that we call postmodernism. And I've spoken about that before. I don't want to bore you with technical terms, but it helps us to know about these sorts of things because we can better appreciate what's happening. When we talk to our next door neighbor now, and we get the kind of strange responses now are just apathy, if not hostility, when we talk about the gospel now. And we realize that in yesteryear it seemed to be easier. Well, that may be the case generally. It might have been a little easier. Because in yesteryear, so many of our peers, our neighbors and friends and family members, sort of thought on the same level and in the same kind of terms that we think. This whole issue, this whole subject matter is the question of what philosophers like to call epistemology. Epistemology, again, a technical term, and I apologize, but it is an important one. Epistemology. Back in the 1970s, I remember the late gospel preacher and philosopher, Christian philosopher, Dr. Thomas B. Warren used to write many wonderful articles in the Spiritual Sword magazine that we get, the journal we get on a regular basis. And he wrote in other forums as well, and he talked about the need to understand what's happening in our culture, the change in epistemology. Now, some gospel preachers kind of laughed and said, that's Warrenism. And they would caricature Warren because of his getting involved in that aspect of philosophy. But he saw something. He perceived something that was going on then. The late Francis Schaeffer, who's not a member of the church, also said there is a major shift in our culture in how we view truth itself. What is ultimately true? This is the philosophical question of epistemology, the study of knowledge. How do we come to know anything at all? How can we justify our beliefs? What is the relationship between faith and knowledge? What is the relationship between faith and evidence? These are the sorts of questions raised in philosophy. So many times we've decried the problems in our public schools, and we realize much of it goes back to some decisions made by the higher courts of our land. For example, that only science, so-called, could be presented in the classrooms, or history, or other very empirical sounding disciplines, but religion could not be addressed or not be dealt with or not promoted in our classrooms. Now we know why they said those sorts of things. We've all heard the hackneyed arguments they make. You know, there's a separation of church and state that was envisioned by our founding fathers, and the phrase was made famous by Thomas Jefferson in the famous Danbury letter and things like that. And this was the original idea that there's a great wall of separation between church and state. And therefore, since these are state schools, state-sponsored schools, then the state must be separate from religion, the argument goes. So if you were to suggest to a student in class that his or her origins could be divine, then you crossed over into another subject matter known as the area of religion, and that is proscribed in our schools. But if you suggest to a child that his or her origins is that of being descended from the apes, a mere graduate animal, an accident not foreseen, not foreplanned, then that's the area of science. Who defines knowledge today? This is the ultimate question. Who tells us what real knowledge is? Belief in God. Oh, that's your personal opinion. That's fine, they would say. Keep it in the churches. Keep it in your home, your private life. You cannot introduce it into the public forum. Because science deals with truth, they would allege. Religion deals with, well, what you want to believe. Wishful thinking. And we have allowed them to make that strong distinction between truth and religion, between science and religion. When in the case before us, when we ask what is truth, neither one is strictly religious if you're thinking of dividing up the academic disciplines. Both have to do with philosophy. Philosophy. These are philosophical questions. Our courts are allowing a philosophy, various philosophies, to be taught in our public school system that are contrary to other philosophies. They have favored, privileged certain philosophies over others. For example, what? Well, they would allege science must always give explanations that are naturalistic in their nature. They must be naturalistic. In other words, the cause and effect relations we see in the natural world, the material world only. That's alone science. Anything beyond that would be considered religious. As a matter of fact, anything beyond that is not religious, strictly. It's philosophical. And this is also philosophical. When they teach Darwinism, they're not teaching strict science. They're teaching the philosophy of naturalism. It's philosophical naturalism. The state has now favored a certain philosophical point of view. That all there is nature, and that's real knowledge. What is truth? Pilate had asked. Jesus came into this world to bear witness to the truth. We are to think on the truth. The truth is that which is really real. Now, I don't mean to be redundant. And I'm not the one that came up with that expression. Consider it. It's that which is actually the case. In other words, a true statement is a statement that really corresponds with reality. I mentioned the crisis of truth we've experienced in our culture. Part of it has to do with the fact the idea of correspondence has been abandoned. And there are reasons why. There are ulterior motives. You see, the other two ways people try to define truth is not by correspondence with reality, but by coherence, if you can come up with a system that kind of works within itself, regardless of how different it is from any other system, that's immaterial. Or by pragmatism, the third approach, that which works. And this is the favorite view here in this country, pragmatism, which is a philosophical point of view. What is truth? Well, that which works. Why do we say it that way? Because we're assuming, again, philosophical naturalism. All there is nature. All that really is, not what people think in the pews, but what really exists, what science can deal with, is nature. And this means we are nothing but evolved creatures. This means that our sole purpose is to survive and to procreate. This means then whatever helps us to survive and procreate is what is true, according to the pragmatic theory. And this is the basis for postmodernism. It looks at that which is earthly. It minds earthly things, as Paul warned about in Philippians 3 and verse 19. It is therefore a philosophy, whether it claims to be or not, that is based upon philosophical naturalism. What is truth? Jesus came to bear witness to the truth. Well, first of all, if we don't understand truth as correspondence, we'll never get off the ground. Truth is correspondence. Somebody says, well, I don't find that terminology in the scriptures, truth as correspondence, but the idea is everywhere. Long ago, Jacob thought his son Joseph had died. Now, the other brothers brought in a tricky thing. It was a devious thing. The coat of many colors dipped in animal's blood to make it look as though Joseph had been slain by a wild animal. And he had shown that to their father, and he grieved for years, thinking he had lost his son Joseph. He grieved because he saw the evidence, quote unquote, the evidence that was manufactured, fabricated, that there had been death. That boy was not dead. And he grew up to be a man. He was not dead. But Jacob in his mind thought for sure he was dead. His idea did not correspond with reality. And the scriptures throughout speak of that common sense view. That which is real is that which is true, about which we can speak. We speak the truth, and our words correspond with the way things really are. What is really the case. Now this sort of thing matters today to help us to understand what's happening. And it does help us. And he says, whatsoever things are true. We could say, by the way, although this will shade off into the next element of our knowledge, that what is true begins with the fact, I exist, you exist. The world around us exists. Now, there are odd philosophies that deny the existence of the world, but they're just that, they're odd. And again, there may be an ulterior reason for that. And it usually goes back to morality and wanting to live as one wants to live. But there is a real world. There are hard bodies in this world. There's reality, physical reality. Christians know there is a physical world. We just understand it cannot be explained in its own terms, on its own terms. It must be explained by something beyond itself. That is God. And thus we know God exists, as we will see in a moment. This is a major element of our thinking. And we will also see that which is true is that which Jesus bore witness to, the truth about his being the Son of God, the Messiah. And of course the revelation that he gives us through the teaching of his apostles that we have in Scripture today. That is true. Paul says, whatsoever things are true. Brothers and sisters, we've got to start thinking on that which is true and not purely escapism and purely fictional thing. Now, there's nothing wrong with fiction. There's nothing wrong with comedy, for example. I like to watch the old clips of the Three Stooges and things like that, maybe to a fault. Those sorts of things are entertaining, and they can be ennobling. Most of the time, they're just diversions. But the Bible recognizes the need for humor, and it sometimes will deal with it. You know, he says there are some who strain out a gnat, swallow a camel. Now, if that wasn't meant to be funny, and you know there had to be a chuckle in the room when Jesus first said it, I don't know what is. Of course, he's getting the point across. There's nothing wrong with comedy, but we have to be careful even with fiction, noble fiction about ideals and, for example, the courage of the protagonists in our novels we read about. And they're going through struggles in life and overcoming them. Those things can be good because they could correspond ideally to the way things are. But there is fiction in this world that tears down and destroys, and that we must be cautious of. And then he goes on to say, whatsoever things are, well, the King James says honest, whatsoever things are honest. And you will find other translations that will say honorable. These are closely related ideas, but the better ideas, our translation here is honorable. Whatsoever things are honorable. Now, I believe Paul has shifted from what we would call epistemology in philosophy. How do we know anything? To the broad question of what is really real, what is ultimately real, metaphysics, that which is beyond the physics, that which is beyond the physical world. Now he's dealing with metaphysics, and he tells us we're to think in those terms. This is the Greek word semnon. It means that which is worthy of respect. I think one of the newer translations so translates it. That which is worthy of veneration, that which is worthy of worship. Now notice the essential point, that which is beyond the merely mundane, that which is beyond the merely physical or material. We are to think on that which is honorable. This word can be used in other contexts to refer to people in some cases, as in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 8. Deacons are to be grave, the King James says grave. Here is this word. It means honorable, worthy of respect. And aged men also are to be honorable, worthy of respect. Titus 2 and verse 2. So obviously that would involve godly elders, qualified elders, and so on. But the word here in this emphasis probably has more to do with God himself, deity. The divine is worthy of respect. It's worthy of reverence. This is an understanding then of the correct object of what is really sacred. That which is really real and precious beyond all belief. Our contemporaries, most have no concept of the sacred. They've completely forgotten. Some things are special and not to be trifled with, not to be spoken of in a bad way. Sometimes television can really grate on a Christian's ears. You'll watch a movie and you'll hear the worst blasphemy that can ever be imagined coming out of the lips of the people who are acting their parts and written by them by the script writers who are often very antagonistic to Christianity. And they will say things about God and Christ that are unbelievably blasphemous and profaning the way of God, profaning the name of God. It seems to be standard fare for much of what we consider to be today entertainment. We are to think on divine beings and divine values. We are to think of what is honorable, not mock traditional values, such as traditional morality, such as natural marriage between a man and a woman, which is God-ordained marriage, as our culture is doing today by the so-called homosexual marriage. We are to know who is worthy of our worship and what is worthy of our worship. Our contemporaries worship the world. They think on earthly things, this world, material things. This is the official philosophy of our schools, so-called science, which is the philosophy of Darwinian evolutionism. It has been privileged. They've won in court, and now that's being taught. And yet we know our minds are to dwell on God who is beyond this world. And if we do that, brothers and sisters, I'm convinced if we can really begin to grasp the greatness of our infinite God, we will be better people on every level. Every bit of our lives will improve. The more we let go of our own selves and our own little world and realize that there has always been, from all eternity, this divine being who is infinite. God is, and everything else is secondary, made by God. Whatsoever things are honorable. Metaphysics. Now, pardon the technical terms here, but this is interesting. The next thing he says, whatsoever things are just. One newer translation says, whatsoever things are right. The same idea. Here he's touching on the theme of philosophy known as axiology. Axiology is the study of values. What's really important? What really matters? And it's particularly the study of ethics or morality. There is so much injustice in our world, that which is not just. Many centuries ago, and this is hard to read, it really is without tears in your eyes. The wise man Solomon in Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 1 said he returned and he considered or beheld all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And he thought of the tears of all the oppressed and how they had no comforter. The power was on the side of the oppressors. And the ones who are oppressed had and have no comforter. We live in a very special place that has been guarded by God through His providence to this point, to have relative freedoms that many have never enjoyed in the history of mankind. And for that we should be thankful. But the world around us is not that way everywhere. Maybe parts of Western Europe. But you go to the East, and you go to Asia in particular, you'll find so many totalitarian regimes. And so many in our own country who are trying to impose that sort of philosophical, naturalistic point of view on everybody, where might makes right and power is in the hands of the oppressors because they have it. Power, that's it. That's everything. What makes a law just or unjust? I mentioned postmodernism, and I will remind us again that the major shift that has happened in the knowledge area has happened also in the area of law and government. Ideas have consequences, you see. For a long time, for centuries, in fact, British common law, and we're mostly heirs to that except for Louisiana, but all the other 49 states are heirs to British common law. Louisiana is different historically. It's civil law from Spain and France. And even there you have similar ideas. It's not that vastly different. But British common law believe there are higher laws that transcend the mere temporal laws of any nation at any given time or any region of a nation. That there are some things that are always wrong. And they would speak of what they called natural law, going back to Hugo Grotius and others like the other philosophers who've been very influential. That which all men can perceive in nature, in studying human nature, some things are always wrong and some things are always right. And just laws that are civil laws are laws that reflect the natural law, the moral law. And if a civil law is contrary to the moral law, it's not a good law. Chris was alluding to this the other day in one of his lectures where he talked about the problems in Nazi Germany and the punishment they justly deserved after the war, after all the people they had persecuted in the name of ethnic cleansing or whatever, National Socialism, how that we had a right to try them. The world had a right to try them, and that at that time, one of our own justices said they had violated the law of God, a higher law. You won't hear that today because in the last several decades, there's been a major shift in our law schools. This is the most dangerous thing we face, in my opinion. Now there are studies called critical legal studies, critical legal theory. Well, what's the difference? It doesn't believe there's natural law. Going back to Oliver Wendell Holmes. There is nothing but might. There is what the courts can get away with. There is what the judges can do with impunity. There is what will be backed up by the force of arms. The state is nothing but the force of arms. It does not recognize a higher power because it's based on philosophical naturalism. Darwinian evolutionism. All there is nature. Therefore, power is everything. Survival of the fittest, the fittest. It is social Darwinism gone to seed. Whether they like the term or not, they disavow the term. That's what it is. Critical legal theories cannot recognize that which is really just. So we had the infamous case a few years ago that I believe was a turning of the corner in this country, seen in a very public way, of the death of Terri Schiavo, who was starved to death, despite the pleas of her own family members to keep her alive by some two-bit judge down in Florida. And the cowardice on the part of federal officials who did nothing about it. And the cowardice on the part of Florida higher officials who did nothing about it. Now we see celebrities who are accused and convicted of crimes, and yet they seem to be able to walk. Some are covered in Teflon. No matter what happens, because of who they are and their names and reputation, they get away with it. That's not justice. That's critical legal theory. It's all politics. Everything is politics, and politics is power. It's dog eat dog. This is the philosophy. And I'm going to be the dog that eats you and everybody else. That's the philosophy. Power politics. Alasdair MacIntyre wrote a book with the question in the title, Whose Justice? Whose Morality? Which is a famous initial salvo in the postmodernist movement. Well, God's justice is what's really justice. God's rationality is what's really rational and real. Who decides equity and fairness in our society? Just dealings? Well, it should be ultimately the will of God. Now here's where I differ perhaps with even our own framers, our own founders. Maybe I don't differ. But here's where my point of view differs with the interpretation today that's common about our framers' intent. If they had really wanted to separate church and state in an absolute way, they were wrong. But that's not what they wanted to do. I believe historically it can be documented. They simply didn't want any particular denomination or sectarian body to be the state-sanctioned religion, such as Anglicanism had been in England or Catholicism in other lands. They didn't want that sort of thing. One church that had all the favor of the state. But alas, what has happened is the church of secularism got it anyway. So it has the favor of the state. We don't have separation of church and state. We have a national religion, and it's a civic religion. It's known as Darwinianism. That's what it is. But this was the intent of the founding fathers. But returning to my point, if they had wanted to separate radically morality from law, then they would have been wrong. But they didn't. As we saw recently in a study, they all wanted to wed law, just law, to the will of God. And that, the Christian God, that's also documented as some fine studies have been presented here. Whatsoever things are just, he says, we're to think on those things. Then he goes on to talk about more axiology, or study of value. Whatsoever things are pure. This again has to do with ethics. This is the Greek word hagnos, and it's from the same root word hagios, which means holy, and this means free from defilement. So whatsoever things, brothers and sisters, are free from defilement, we're to think of those things. God is free from defilement. God ultimately is pure. And God's will is pure as expressed in Scripture. But the world is wicked because it rebels against the will of God. The world is contaminated by lusts. It's contrary to the ways of God. There are things that can be pure. There are objects of thought that can be pure. And even people themselves can be said to be pure. As in Matthew 5 and verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Well, those are people who habitually think pure thoughts. In contrast to other characters described in the Bible, as in 2 Timothy 2:14, the wicked who would even come into the love feast, who are having eyes full of adultery and that cannot cease from sin. He says those aren't pure people. Jesus said in Matthew 5 and verse 28, for example, if we look upon a woman to lust after her, we've committed adultery with her already in our hearts. A brother in a county nearby in a Bible class was saying it's all right for young people to dance, to get together and to gesticulate as long as they're not too close. And other silly things like that. We who are adults understand the danger of the modern dance and the sexuality that's involved. And they do too. Oh, they do too. You go out to the websites and look up high school proms and you will see all the snide and lewd remarks that are made about the dance and what he thought and she thought and said, what happened after that. They know it. We're chumps. We're not really. We're not chumps. We just deliberately hide from the truth if we think dancing is an innocuous little thing. But he says that's all right. So I'm opposed to him. He went off and split the church and started his own congregation. This happens time and again. Worldliness in the church, but we must control our thoughts and be pure. I've mentioned Judd Brzezinski, who is a philosopher at the University of Texas, who's talked about how lust can enter into our minds with a furtive glance, for example. And he says, we may not be able to keep the unwanted guest from entering the house of our thoughts, but we can't easily force her outside once she's entered, but we sure don't have to invite her to stay, to paraphrase what he said. We don't have to ask her to sit down and have a chat with us. When that thought enters our mind, we need to think of something else and have it to leave. Whatsoever things are pure. And then he goes on to say, whatsoever things are lovely, beautiful. Now, this is also the branch of philosophy known as axiology, the study of value. And aesthetics is a branch of that, the study of what's beautiful. Now, at this point, I know a lot of people think, well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That is true to an extent. A lot of the music I like to listen to from the 1970s, from my generation, not all of it, but a lot of it, is pretty good in my estimation. I like old classic rock, for example. But my daddy, that's not beautiful to him. But he has some songs he used to like to hear, bluegrass and things. Well, that is beautiful to me, by the way. I have kind of an eclectic ear for things like that. That's beautiful. Beautiful music. But there's a lot of music that's not. It's terribly destructive. Some of the so-called music today that's heard in our time is unspeakably vulgar. Degrading to women, for example. Degrading to society. Inculcating lust. Inculcating violence. Inciting to riot. That's not lovely. That's down in the dirt, animalistic. And what do you expect when you teach them from their youngest days? That's all they are, animals. According to Darwinism, that's the theory that's being taught in our schools and all around us. And the music and the artwork reflects it. I'm not the first to comment on this. There's some famous people. You've heard of Picasso and you've seen some of his weird paintings. He made a lot of political statements in his art, and he said art is not to decorate apartments. Art is a weapon of revolution. Much of the sexual revolution that took place in this country in the 60s was from art, decadent art, and some of that was from the music. I'll have to admit there were extremes and excesses to a lot of the lyrics and a lot of the beats, other factors to the music of our time, and to the other art, especially that which passes for art, the cinema, if you could even call it that. A pleasing work of art should coincide rationally and ethically with divine ideals, noble things. Congressman Henry Hyde a few years ago said, art detached from the quest for truth and goodness is simply self-expression and ultimately self-absorption. Yes? There was an American sculptor, Wheeler Williams, who said modern art was to destroy man's faith in his cultural heritage. You didn't have to tell me that. You're an artist and you know what you're all about, what the whole thing is about for so many. I could see it. Our cultural heritage was a Judeo-Christian society, roughly so, based on Christian ideals in particular, that now they want to subvert and destroy, and they use art to do so. And yet he says we're to think on beautiful things, and last of all, if there is anything of good report. Now this is again axiology, or the study of ethics or morality. Here's the word euphemos, and it's related to the word euphemia. The reason I mention that in the Greek is it sounds similar to words we use. Euphemism, that's where we get the word from. You'd use a good word, a pleasant word, in place of a bad word. Well, what this really means is a good report, a good saying about somebody, a good reputation. Paul talked about how he didn't always have the good sayings about him. 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 8, there were good reports about him. There were bad reports from his enemies about him. They weren't necessarily true. They were just bad reports. Dysphemia, those evil reports. But in contrast, we're to think of good reports. Now, this is not so much a warning about us spewing out gossip as it is entertaining gossip and listening to it. That's the warning here. We hear bad things about other people and we receive those good reports or bad reports. And yet love thinketh no evil, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 5. So it summarizes, or we can do so, these things we're to think on. That which is true, according to the law of rationality. That which is honorable. We study apologetics to know that which is ultimately real and worthy of honor is God. That which is just. Public morality, laws should reflect the will of God. That which is pure, private morality, should also reflect the will of God. That which is lovely, that which reflects the noble ideals of God, even our entertainment. That which is of good report, our interpersonal relations and the things we say about each other should reflect the will of God. But to see these things in perspective, we have to have some kind of test or criterion to know what are good reports and what are pure things. How do we test the things we hear and think about? Well, it says if there be any virtue and if there be any praise. Virtue is mental excellence. It's a moral quality. It's a moral power. And any praise, that which is praiseworthy. Ultimately, God is praiseworthy. So it all boils down to this. It's very simple. We understand this. It's the will of God. The will of God. How do I know the will of God? It's taught in Scripture. And in Scripture alone. Here we have the will of God. And as I search Scripture, I know what God's will for my life is. I know what's lovely and good and what things I'm to think upon. Deliberately, on purpose, think about these things and not about their opposites. And when I do, I begin controlling my thoughts and controlling my very being in a way I never have in the past. And thus I become a different person, a better person. Psychologists who've studied emotional issues in our day have said there's usually one common denominator. And that's people constantly digging into the past about past omissions and commissions and not disciplining their thoughts to think about the present and the future. The past is the past. Forget those things that are behind. And now the future is before us. Reach forth to those things which are before. And in that way, we can have the peace of God that passeth all understanding. And that's our goal, true happiness. It begins by obeying the will of God, by being immersed in water for the forgiveness of sins, to wash away sins, Acts 22:16. It continues by a sanctified life of obedience to God. If you have not followed up on that, and there's something amiss in your life as an erring child of God, this is a good time for you to get that right with God. Whatever you need to do, do it right now while together we stand and sing.